Welcome, listeners, to another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love, hosted by Richard Ostler. My guest on today's podcast is my friend, Emerson Fersch, who's joining from his home in Cedar City via Zoom. Welcome to the podcast, Emerson.
Thank you, Richard. Thanks for the time.
Will you tell our listeners, since you have a very unique first name and last name, will you tell our listeners how to spell both those names and if there's a story behind either of those names?
So Emerson's Emerson, one M. And then my last name is Fersch. The Fersch is, I think, German, Belgium. I've traced it as far back as to Austria. My first name, Emerson, I'm actually named after my dad, whose first name was also Emerson, his name came from my grandfather's best friend, who was Harry Emerson Fosdick, who you may be familiar with. He was a well-known theologian, I guess, back in the late or early 20th century, and he was a personal friend of my grandfather's. He was a Baptist minister in New Hampshire. So that's where the Emerson comes from.
Well, we're sure glad to have you on the podcast. By way of introduction, Emerson Fersch is a recent release stake president in the East Long Beach area. He moved from that area, lives in Cedar City. I became aware of Emerson when he invited me to speak at stake conference. I talked about LGBTQ, but what Emerson or President Fersch did in that stake and was just to create Zion, a feeling that everybody is welcome in that stake. And we will talk about kind of two things in this podcast: Emerson's conversion story to the church, and then we'll talk about what he did as a stake president. Our joint prayer is that if you're a local leader, a parent, or someone that's just trying to create Zion in your circle of influence, that the things that Emerson shares will give you principles that you can use in your area to help people connect with the gospel of Jesus Christ by creating more feeling of inclusion, acceptance, and support for everybody. Is that okay for an introduction?
That's great. Thank you.
Talk about your life before your church.
So the first thing I think is important is I wasn't raised in a home that practiced any active religion. Like I said, my grandfather was a minister, but my dad was raised Protestant. My mom was Roman Catholic, but we didn't. I think we might have gone to a Lutheran church a couple times growing up, but it wasn't a part of our life. I wasn't daily prayer. Wasn't a part of our life. When we had worldly problems to solve, my dad was a psychoanalyst, but when we had worldly problems to solve, we'd go to the I Ching, which is the Chinese book of, I think, Proverbs or Fortunes or whatever. You throw, a set of pennies 3 times, you come up with a hexagram and look up what how to solve your problem. So that's kind of how the home I was raised in. Both my parents were alcoholic. I eventually, gave into addiction myself. And I bring that up because, I wasn't out there, as they say, out there for a long period of time. I mean, I started drinking and doing drugs when I was in college, right after I left, went to St. Louis for school. And amazingly, I actually did pretty well in spite of everything, but dropped out after a couple of years and just, the mid 80s are a bit of a blur. Hung out with a lot of seedy people, got into a lot of really dangerous situations, driving in blackouts, buying drugs off the streets. I mean, and I think about it now, it's like somebody else's life. But the reason I think it's important is because I guess in the Book of Mormon, I've always connected with the sons of Mosiah, the vilest of sinners.
Wow.
And how, there's that scripture about Moroni, about the very gates of hell would shake, but the scripture after that holds Moroni up to the standard of the sons of Mosiah. They were such evil guys, and yet they say, Moroni was like even unto the sons of Mosiah. And so that's kind of been my experience in terms of my relationship with God, because I was a bum. And for a lot of people, did a lot of bad things, and yet was saved, for lack of a better way to put it. I was never, God never gave up on me. And when I had a moment of clarity that alcoholics and drug addicts talk about, and reached out for help, I had called Cigna, the healthcare place I had through my work. I still had a job, so I was a functional addict, I guess they say. And I called and wanted to go see a therapist because I knew I didn't have any friends. My life was kind of a mess. And the lady started asking me these questions on the phone, and there was this thing called the 20 questions that came out of Johns Hopkins University years ago. And if you answered yes to 3 of them, it meant you had an addiction problem. And I answered yes to 16.
Wow.
And yeah, and that was the miracle of it, because if it had been 4 or 5, I could have probably rationalized that away. And, I'm not that bad. But 16 was enough for me to listen to the lady, and she said, "You need to come in and talk to somebody." And I did. And 3 nights later, I was sitting in a parking lot at a church in Granada Hills, getting ready to go to my first AA meeting. And I remember sitting in my car thinking, what am I doing here? And I went in, and it was a candlelight meeting where, they put a candle on the table, lights go out, and there was a speaker. And Richard, as soon as I was sitting in that room, I knew I was in the right place. I didn't know why. I didn't know what I was feeling, but I was connected to something that I knew I wanted to hang on to. And of course, I know now that was the Spirit. That was the Holy Spirit that was, just immersing me in warmth and forgiveness and hope. Because I didn't lost hope. I was always even as a little kid, and I didn't grow up, like I said, in the perfect household. It certainly wasn't like the hymn books, and but I always kind of was a person that was optimistic. Somehow things are going to work out, and I lost that. I lost that somewhere along that 7-year period of time where I was out there in the darkness, and so I found light. I found light in AA, and that's what opened up my relationship with God. And I can zoom through a lot of that, but through some very good men that I met, that sponsored me, that really helped me grow up. I learned the importance of prayer. I
Wow.
learned the importance of service. Even donating my money. I found I all these things that I didn't think would ever happen for me. I found a career. I started to be able to have healthy relationships with people. I cleaned up the wreckage of my past. I made amends to employers I stole money from. I went back and was willing to just, repent. With what's that word? Restitution. Cleaned it all up to the best I could. And so when I met my wife Darcy, who was a member, I remember I was actually scared because I was used to dating people that had problems, baggage, just so I was drawn to, because I felt like that's kind of what I brought to the table. And she was like a healthy person, she was just like normal, right? Just a successful woman, had a great job, smart, self-respect, all these qualities that truthfully I wasn't really used to. And she was a member of the church. And so at the time, I'd been very heavily involved in AA, 4 meetings a week. I commitments
Wow.
at these meetings, which is like a calling. I'd be the treasurer, or the secretary, or make the coffee, or whatever. I also did panels, which is where you bring groups of recovering alcoholics into hospitals or recovery homes, or we used to even go to this lockdown place in Norwalk, where literally people were like in a lockdown ward and they couldn't get out. And so it was, a lot of these things were already in place before the church was presented to me. And, again, I'm kind of giving you the long, short version, but I met my wife. We didn't really talk a lot about church. We just knew we had similar values. And, when I asked her to marry me, I knew she was the right one pretty, early on. We were both older at that point too. We were in our late 30s. She had to wait for me to get myself together. She wanted to be married by the Mormon bishop. And so, I didn't have a fine, whatever. I don't have my own bishop, so yours is as good as any, right? And so we met with him. And what happened was that she got tied up with her family. This was, I think, the Wednesday before the Saturday where we did our wedding. And so I went because I didn't want to leave him hanging. I couldn't call him. And so I went and showed up, and we had about an hour. He and I could just talk. And he was just a normal guy, Jeff Perry. In fact, you probably know that name. He'll probably come up later in our little story. But he was a normal guy. He was a Cardinals fan, which we have that in common because I went to school in St. Louis, and my dad, I inherited that from him. But I just connected, and I shared with him a lot of what I just told you, and he didn't bat an eye. There was no judgment. There was no, give me the evil eye. None of that. He just, was, hey, great, you're here. It was just respect, and I felt safe and welcome. So we got married, and then 3 months later, I remember calling up the sister missionaries, and I remember at the time I didn't realize that wasn't something that happened a lot. People calling wanting them to come over and teach. So they were a little surprised. And June of '99, about I guess 2 months after we got married, I was baptized.
Wow.
Yeah, and from there, I got a calling notice form. I got called the elders forum president about. I think I was a member a year and a half. Then I got called to be a bishop in the 11th ward, which is no longer around. That was about 4.5 years as a member, and then the boundaries changed, and I served 2 more years as a bishop in the 10th ward, and then executive secretary until I had the last assignment I had.
As stake president of the Long Beach East Stake.
Yep.
So thanks for just being honest with us and sharing about, I think, and being vulnerable just with your pre-church life and the road you walked. And now I've never really heard that. And now I sort of better understand why everybody in your stake, at least everybody I'm aware of, felt really safe talking to you because of the way Jeff Perry treated you when you opened up about your past and how healing and compassionate he was. And just, I think you would have done that naturally knowing you, but having that example of a LDS leader that treated you that way, that I've noticed you seem to be doing that for everybody else. And to me, the atonement's kind of theoretical sometimes, Emerson, but I think it's all real for all of us. But maybe for someone that's just had your experiences pre-church, it becomes even more real. Being in those dark, hopeless spaces, and that contrast between darkness and light is very real in your life. And I would think that your ability to sort of, from a practical standpoint, connect people with the same healing feeling you felt with the atonement as part of your ministry. Does that resonate with you? Just that this is not theoretical for you. This is like life changing what happened to you, and you then can help others take advantage of the same blessings.
For sure. I mean, the gift for me, and I assume everybody has their moment one way or the other, because it's personal how the Lord connects with us through the Spirit. But I absolutely have no doubt. I cannot look at the life I live today with, having been self-employed for 25 years. I manage close to $200 million of people's hard-earned money. I've served as an elected official in Signal Hill as a treasurer for almost three terms before we moved. I managed. I handled their portfolio. And I'm not sharing. The point is how do you go from this guy the way I was, driving up and down the streets up by LAX, looking for people selling dime bags on the street, to this life, being a father, being able to be in a healthy marriage with a healthy woman, hold, important positions in church. So I cannot deny the hand of God. I can't take credit for any of it because it's clear to me my own thinking and my own choices didn't get me very far. And God went in and plucked me out. He didn't give up on me. And so my thought is because I'm nothing special. So if he'll do that for me, he'll do it for anybody. He loves all of us. He loves all of us, no matter our choices. He knows who we are, and he knows our heart. And that's the only thing I can think of. He must have known at some point I'd figure it out before I killed myself. And the chances and things would line up. And that's pretty much how it's been. That's been sort of the tone that was set, before I became a member. It was just trusting God, surrender, all these AA principles, let go and let God. And, you see these bumper stickers, surrender, all these things. That's just, it became a foundation, which played actually transferred and played really well in leadership roles because there's a lot of pain, as you know, probably better than I do, out there. People sit in church their pews, and everybody looks good and has the right smile on their face a lot of the times. But I learned early on as a bishop, there's just a lot of pain, and a lot of pain people typically have a hard time talking about because they somehow there's this thing in church sometimes where people think that if I'm doing everything right, things shouldn't happen. And if something's happening, then maybe I'm not doing everything right. And which is just completely, God isn't a punishing God. I mean, life is life, and we have free agency, and we're subject to the free agency of others, and it has no bearing on. God knows our heart. That doesn't mean it's not going to rain sometimes, for us. I don't know. Does that sort of?
It makes a lot of sense. And it just seems like these experiences just opened the door for the ministry you had that I became connected with when you served as stake president. Go back to, if you can, think about when you were called as stake president. Um, is this a, what if I had met you that night as you were set apart and kind of reflective on what you wanted to accomplish in the stake? And then what I kind of saw through you, what you did and getting to know people in your stake, this feeling of creating Zion, is that what you, was that on your radar map when you were first called, or did that come gradual in your ministry?
That came a year before I got called.
Talk about that.
So I mentioned actually I dropped out of college, and had uh, gone through, but anyway, I was basically actually back enrolled at St. Louis University, which is where I went for 2 years. I had nightmares over the years of I'd find myself in a dream back in school, but in my dream thinking, I can't be here. I've got a family and I've got work. It haunted me. And so I went back, and I was actually finishing up my undergrad. And I had a class called Spirituality and Leadership. And it was studying the Jesuits, and it was an amazing class because there's a lot of parallels. I mean, Jesuit means Society of Jesus, and their whole, I guess, mission statement was save, help souls, right? This open-ended, that's it. And I loved it. I was drawn to it because these guys were traveling in boats, going all over the country, the world, not knowing what the plan was. It was just this trusting, and eventually they settled into these educational institutions as kind of their niche. But it inspired me. And then the final project we had to write was, I don't remember exactly what it was, but it came to me. I put a presentation together about building Zion. That was my final thing for the class, and that's when it sunk in. And then, as President Alstrom's term started running out, and I was serving with him, and he was the executive secretary, these feelings were coming to my mind. I had an idea, truthfully, when I was called, because my leadership trajectory in church has been pretty linear. Just it's kind of unique for some, especially as a convert and all. But it just seemed like I was being prepared. And so I took a lot of notes, wrote down a lot of things that came to my mind over that 4-year period of time. But it was that last year that it was clear to me I needed to be ready. And, you go through that whole thing about, well, you don't want to aspire for the assignment. But on the other hand, I knew myself well enough to know what I was feeling was real. And so it was a burden. But yeah, to answer your question, I didn't know what that meant per se. That became clear pretty quickly after I started to serve. But I knew that being united, and I got to share this because it just came to my mind. But there's an elder Robert Packer. I don't know what he's doing now. I think he still went to serve a mission, and he's involved with something to do with public affairs or communications in California or the area. He came out and spoke at a state conference. I think it was in 2013, the year before I got called, and he had a Saturday night session where he had no plan. And he just opened it up to the membership to start talking. And I was shocked because people, including a previous state president, another woman I know from our ward, everybody started opening up about how they didn't feel like they were doing enough and how they didn't feel like they were good enough. And it was like cathartic because it was like people had all this stuff, and he just created an environment where people could just lay it out there. It was a gift. And I never forgot that because I'm thinking, gosh, we need more of this. We need more of this honesty. We need more of this ability for people just to be themselves. How do you bear another person's burden when you don't even know what it is? Right? So that impressed me. And so that was all part of this
Say
thing.
his name. Say his name again for our listeners.
It's Robert Packer.
Okay, Robert
And he's
Packer.
great. And that was a blessing of my calling as executive secretary because I got to sit in and meet a lot of the visiting authorities. And he just stood out because honestly, I mean, everybody's different, but oftentimes I felt very stifled. I mean, honestly, it was just, I just felt, he just was a breath of fresh air. Maybe I should just leave it at that, and I appreciated his personality and the way he was able to effectively unite a state over a weekend. It was just, it was him, and I connected to that. So that all kind of carried in. So when I got called, I remember it was, one of those days you don't forget in life. I my interview wasn't kind of what I expected. It was Elder Piper and this Elder Frost, who was from Arizona. Elder Frost was more of the touchy-feely guy, and Elder Piper, he's pretty much all business. And so I had my interview, and it wasn't anything particular. It wasn't like, I felt this confirmation. I remember texting Darcy, I'm sitting in high council, and thinking, maybe I was just completely off base. And then when they finally told me to call her, and all these things I've been feeling were coming to truth. That was just one of those moments. And so, anyway, but I knew I was prepared.
I love the history of that. And I love your shout out to your dear wife, Darcy, who I've met a couple times, and she's great. And what a great team you make. I just want you to start talking about just creating then Zion in your stake. Obviously, we talk a lot about LGBTQ in this podcast, and there's a couple of podcasts we've done with Scott Osmond, episode 162, and Mike Sechrist, 168. I encourage our listeners, after listening to this podcast, if you haven't, we're going to talk about Scott and Michael in this podcast. Please listen to those two episodes for the full story and the impact of President Fersch in their life and where they are with the church right now because of President Fersch and the feeling of belonging that they feel there, which is what Elder Ballard asked us to do in last general conference, create more of a feeling of belonging, which I think is a sister goal to creating Zion. That's kind of, part of creating belonging. But just talk wherever you want to go next.
Okay, so 2 points that I don't want to forget, and hoping you'll hang on to them for me if I get derailed. One is the spirit, the role of the spirit, because I think I'm a big Robert Kennedy fan. Who's probably, if you ask me who my hero is, moral hero, he's the guy. And he talked about moral courage. And I just want to share this with you real quick. Few men are willing to brave the disapproval of their peers, the censure of their colleagues, the wrath of their society. Moral courage is a rare commodity, and bravery in battle with great intelligence. Yet it is the one essential, vital quality for those who seek to change their world that yields most painfully to change. And I bring that up because, honestly, Richard, nothing that we did was any agenda. It was nothing I had in my mind. It was simply create Zion. And the Spirit opened the doors because the one thing I did bring to the table is I wasn't afraid to follow it. I've never been burdened by the traditions of our fathers, so to speak, when it comes to church. I question everything. And I honestly think that's healthy. At least it works for me. But I also want to point out that this is what I learned about keys, because none of this was all following counsel. And you brought up a point, I think, before we got into our discussion about the leaders not wanting to tell people how to do things. Some people I've learned think keys are simply you're set apart, you're given these keys, and you basically sort of follow orders and stick to the narrative and, keep doing the same thing that's always been done. Don't step out of line because you'll get ahead of the brethren. And I've never understood that get ahead of the brethren, because I was set apart with key. If it didn't matter, if all it was a matter of just towing the line, so to speak, what different? Why would I be called than anybody else? It wouldn't matter. We obviously in callings get blessed, we learn, we grow, but we also bring something to the table. I'm convinced my role was to do exactly what I did. The Spirit opened these doors, and I wanted, hopefully that'll come out through, as I'll share with you kind of how all this went. I thought building Zion was really just uniting our stake. My view was very small. We had all these little wards. We had a couple of culture wards, which, really I don't think it was half culture wards, language wards, Spanish branch. We had a Cambodian ward. We had the Orange County ward, which is Los Alamitos, which I was in. And, there was sort of this separation from the Long Beach ward. Everybody had their little fight, and it was not a united group. And so the first task at hand was to break down this wards of Zion perception and create, more of a, hey, we're a stake of Zion. And so a lot of that had to do with the state conferences, which quite frankly were modeled after AA meetings.
Cool.
People sharing honestly. I mean, I'll never forget the first one of these open meetings we did. And it was always set a tone. It was just to exactly as you said, create a place where people could be themselves, not feel like, I had a guy, long-term member, come to me once after one of our meetings and say, it's nice not leaving the state conference feeling like I don't measure up. I mean, we're talking about the church, the Savior. That should be inspiring and uplifting, not making people feel like they're not doing enough, or they're worthless, that they're not earning their way, climbing up Jacob's ladder to heaven. I mean, none of that doesn't make any sense. So I had a brother speak about his conversion, how he resisted the Book of Mormon, I had a woman talk about being divorced after being sealed in the temple. We had another gal that was supposed to talk about breaking off her engagement. She was a YSA and ended up telling me, as she walked up to the podium before the meeting started, I've been inspired to speak about something else. I'm like, uh-oh. And she talked about getting through a pornography addiction before she went on her mission, a female.
Wow.
And depression, anxiety, we've had, everybody just spoke about, one lady who was in an auto accident was disabled, from the neck down. I mean, we had people just share life, but not just about the problems, but how their faith carried them through. In fact, I remember the first night we did this, one guy who was like the fourth or fifth speaker said, he got up there before he started talking, he was, I'm exhausted. Because it was emotionally, people weren't used to it. But I'll tell you, the other thing was, those meetings, right, people from other states started to come. People would stay afterwards. The guy would be, the tech guy would be blinking the lights off and finally shutting them off to get everybody out. And of course, you came. That's when Mike Seacrest gave his beautiful talk when he came out over the pulpit. But the beginning of it was setting a tone that, we need to be open. We need to love each other and accept each other, and quit putting up this image that we're all thinking, this blueprint, perfect life that we all feel like we're supposed to be living up to, that really nobody's life is like that. It's kind of an illusion. From there, the whole idea of Zion opened up. We got counsel about building up our, at the time, public affairs auxiliary and getting involved with the community. And they kind of had a list of different things you could do, whether it's reaching out to the Hispanic community or local politicians or other faiths, just kind of a laundry list of stuff. And all of a sudden that little thing, that council, got me to realize, oh my gosh, Zion isn't just our wards, it's not our stake, it's our whole community. And so I told Lori Pollard, who was called to be our public affairs director, go out and see if you can connect with a Black Baptist church.
Wow.
That was just popped into my head. That's what I told her. And 2 phone calls later, she connects with the First Lady Russell over at Temple Baptist Church, who just, and again, there's no coincidences. So we're doing this backpack project every year, and their sponsor had just backed out, right? So Lori calls her just as they lost this sponsor, and she's scrambling on figuring out how they're going to do the backpack project. And it just so happens that her husband, Tori, who's the pastor, had just been out to I don't know, I call it a due diligence trip. He'd been out with a few other Baptist church leaders out to Salt Lake and gotten a tour of the welfare center, the family history center. They do these kind of outreach tours. Out of anybody we could have picked, right? She calls these guys who not only have a need, but also have had their hearts soft towards us. And I mean, you can't plan this. So we went in, I met with them. I even shared a scripture out of Doctrine and Covenants that talked about Zion and unity and celestial principle. And, he just said right off the bat, he goes, look, I know we may have doctrinal differences, but there's bigger fish to fry. And basically the idea was we got more in common than we don't. We formed a friendship. We ended up stepping in and helping them out with the backpack project. And as the years went by, 200 backpacks became close to 3,000 3 or 4 years later. With members who set up book giveaway thing along with that. So Tori was that. That was the opening of all this. And like I said, the Spirit then just started opening doors. He introduced me to Pastor Nichols, who is a buddy of his from Garden of Praise Christian Fellowship, which is an evangelical church in Carson. And he says, hey, look, my friend's been wanting me to go up to Skid Row with him at midnight. Will you go with me? Why not? So I go up, I meet Pastor Nichols, and he calls me his twin. He's another black minister. He can sing. He's got a lot of talent I don't have, but we're twins in heart. It's kind of a joke. He and I connected right off the bat. And so I went up to Skid Row with this group. Another couple of churches met us up there. And again, 12 midnight. We're walking around LA. And I mean, it was bad then. It's worse now. But we're handing water. We're handing resources, food, whatever, to people right in their tents, marching up and down, 5th and Central. And it just struck me. It's like, my gosh, this is exactly what we need in our state to really soften some hearts. Because it's one thing to just drop off, something at the Salvation Army or, leave, give food to some organization that distributes it. It's another thing to go eyeball with people who are suffering. And so I started calling it bishop's training, and I started dragging up the different leadership from each of the wards up there. And then pretty soon, other people wanted to start coming. And before you know it, we became partners with Garden of Praise, and we're regular contributors of blankets. I used to always get hygiene kits. Everybody kind of found their little niche. Eventually, Jeff Berry, guy's great. He started having people who were afraid to go up would meet early and bag up lunches and put food together. So everybody was getting involved. We had inactive members that, spouses who didn't, just weren't active in church, but that wanted to come out and do this. I had, members from other YSA wards who were just, or people who were investigating, they'd go up. It's one thing to sit in Sunday school and just, hear a lesson and talk about theory about what we should be doing, all that. But when you get out there and actually do it, that's how your heart changes. And so that opened the door to the homeless. And then we had a state conference. I don't know when it was, maybe, I can't remember now the dates, but the challenge to the members was, when you meet a homeless person, ask them their name. Ask them their name. And I started getting these emails from people with all these stories about how, it transformed the homeless guy at the corner when you get off the freeway to, Lamont or Jane or, Larry in front of the Alpha Bay. Everybody all of a sudden became a person and they had a story, and it transformed people. And because all this, people became a person, they became human. And once you get rid of that wall of indifference, and that person's a person to you, that changes your heart. You can't ignore them anymore. And so that was a little step. You see how this is all building. Why? Because I met Tori, because Lori took a phone call from some inspiration I got. She got inspired, called the right church, who then had a friend who got us into the homeless. It just boom, 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 boom. Then we got involved in the city. We started doing homeless counts. We met some contacts there who pulled us into the school system. And so then we started tutoring at one school and then at another school, Willard. And that meeting was in particular particularly interesting because the principal was very hard to get through. We finally met with her. She talked about the trauma with the kids in her particular area, low-income area, and how kids would come to school having been told by their dad that, when they come home, he was going to murder their mother while they were at school. I mean, just bad things. These poor little kids were often just traumatized. And she said, we need to bring God into this campus. Not like we're going to preach, but she needed the spirit. And so we had members, my wife was one of them, and a number of others who went and started tutoring or helping the assist through the teachers at this elementary school. And, we had to go through a bunch of hoops getting TB tested. This is, of course, before COVID and everything. But the point of it is through a lot of persistence, we got in and became very valuable to the Long Beach Unified School District, helping out these teachers who just couldn't attend to each children. And so that was another thing. Again, these doors just opened. And so, I could go on, but this eventually, started, you can see there was a shift. There was a shift in the way people were viewing others. And the other thing of it was, and I heard this from a lot of people, is they've been thirsty, to be a part of a church that actually got involved in the community. And, it became clearer and clearer to me that as we got more enmeshed with the people around us, that it was clear we had a responsibility for this. We absolutely, this isn't just a great idea. This is what it means to be a disciple of Christ. It's even above church at this point. I mean, it's the two great commandments: love God and love your neighbor. And the church is set up in such a perfect way because you don't have paid ministers. You have leadership. It's sustainable. And so I'm gone now, but you still have people who are completely involved, and it's just taken on a life of itself. Then I guess to get to the LGBTQ part of it, because again, you had to open your hearts to the homeless folks. It was just a process. And of course, people sharing their stories about their lives, that and all their personal things that have happened. So you can see a couple, 2-3 years of this. My
Now,
wife then.
before you shift there, I just, for our listeners, as you're writing down notes, just the things that Emerson said that really touched me right there is just the recognition, the realization with that minister from the other church. We have doctrinal differences, but we have bigger fish to fry. You said that so quickly, but that's so powerful. And I just think our heavenly parents like that. When we go to the sort of the common ground, we're all part of the same human family. And if we just stop at doctrinal differences, and then we lose the ability to do what you did and that other church did, because there are bigger fish to fry. There are real significant problems. And if we just create boundaries at doctrinal differences, we're never going to solve those problems. I love what you said about eyeball to eyeball, and that gets you out of the theoretical. And I love what you said about just getting to know the name of a homeless person, how important a name is to somebody. And just this, you also talked about the wall of indifference comes down when you get to know people. And the benefit then to you and your stake members, and to me, because I've seen it firsthand, is our heart changes. And isn't that what the gospel of Jesus Christ is trying to help us do, is change our hearts as part of mortality to become more loving, more Christ-like, more compassionate, have you more humility, and then you're in a position to bear and help other people. But you have to do the things that you're having your stake do, because you're right, you can't just do that sitting in a Sunday school class. That can give you the foundational doctrinal principles, but then you've got to go put it into action. And this is sort of like, your stake and what you're doing is sort of putting it into action and then seeing the fruits of the change of hearts in all of our lives as we're part of this type of service. So now just keep going forward.
Yeah, and one other point on that, I'm glad you brought that up about Pastor Russell when you said that, because the other thing that he brought up a number of times was, because there's been a lot of, in the last 5, 6, 7 years, a lot of racial tension. And our friendship with both these other churches kind of came, it wasn't forced. It was just natural. We had a general affection for each other. Part of the fun with going up to Skid Row was saying prayers with Garden of Praise. Their prayers are different than ours. We had all held hands in a circle, and people will, kind of affirm as the prayer's going on, amen and hallelujah. It's just different, and it was great. And so, but Pastor Russell mentioned, because he said once the racial tension started up again, he goes, I start getting calls from, white churches wanting to sort of force these relationships. And ours just happened.
That's
Again,
cool.
the spirit it was just natural. And so there wasn't this forcing, it was a genuine affection that the members had for each other. Um, so along as and I'm not sure where it fits in, but part of this, I knew the thing was coming to my mind that I needed to also address the LGBTQ community. But again, I was thinking community-wise. I wasn't thinking in terms of ward and stake. I wasn't really aware. I guess I was, but I didn't really think about it. I was thinking more about mending fences after the whole Prop 8, because there was a lot of fractured relationships, and just Long Beach in particular. It was just, it left a bad taste in everybody's mouth, I suppose. Um, and so I reached out to a gentleman at one of the local LGBT centers, and he was very kind, but could never get any follow up with that. And I'm thinking maybe, I thought, geez, here I am showing up at his doorstep, like, okay, I'm ready to go, but maybe he wasn't, and I didn't really think about that at first. And the previous stake president had two sons that came out, and so
President Ostrom.
yeah,
He's
and you probably that the
yeah, what
Alstons.
a great family.
Oh, they're awesome, and so I had Shar agreed to give a talk on a Sunday at a Sunday session of conference. And again, this is a credible speaker, prominent in the stake. I mean, if you're going to have somebody open the door to that, that's the perfect situation. And so she was willing, and she gave a beautiful talk. And I remember, the essence of it was, I have to. My job is to love my sons. I don't have all the answers. She went through a lot about, concern. I'm sure you've experienced this. People have a lot of concern for the well-being of their eternal family, which I think personally that's wrong. People shouldn't have to feel that way. They shouldn't be put in a position to pick between church and their family. We don't. We know we know, but there's a lot we don't know. And so, but she gave this beautiful talk, and it opened the door up. And then, we kind of moved on with some things. And then my wife, brilliant, because she's, it's definitely a partnership in these columns. We were part of this California Conference for Equality and Justice, CCJ, which is a kind of a human, I guess, human relations organization in Long Beach. They try to, their goal, at least it used to be, they've shifted now, but they were really there to ensure that there was no discrimination, in terms of gender, in terms of religion, race. And the fact that they included religion in that is one of the reasons why we were involved, because you don't see a lot of that, really, that's not part of the mission statement of these types of organizations generally. And so they were having speakers come, a woman who you met, Marcia, and her son Aiden Azumi. And Darcy says, you should sponsor them through my work. And I thought, I trusted her on it. It didn't really resonate per se, but I thought, well, why not? And so I did. My firm, I own my own financial planning firm. We Capital Investment Advisors sponsored the Marcia and Aiden to speak. And so part of that, you get to meet the people, but the night before, have dinner. And so Aiden was very standoffish, and I didn't know why at the time, but I learned pretty quickly afterwards why. But Marcia, as you know, she's just really, I love her. She's just an awesome woman. She's, you can't not like her. She just wears her heart on her sleeve. And we started talking, and she was trying to get in to faith groups to help, teach. It wasn't about, convincing. It was just to educate people on transgender and what that's all about. So we learned from her, and we kind of informally agreed that, maybe there's something we could do together. And so they spoke the next morning in front of 1,000 people at this breakfast in Long Beach. I mean, anybody's there. And the thing that got me, and this is, can never share this because it just cuts you, your core. They each kind of conclude, they only had 20 minutes to talk, but they each concluded their little, their presentation with the most memorable thing that had happened, what they learned through this journey. And Marcia, I think it was just getting a hug from her son finally, and for Aiden, his defining moment through all this was when he went to his church leader when he was still a girl, thinking he was lesbian, and came out And the church leader, and it wasn't LDS Church, it was another faith. Not that that really matters, but he was told he didn't have a place there. He was kicked out. He was cast out. And it was at that point where I just thought, you know what? That's just wrong. I don't care about any. That's just wrong. Jesus would not do that. The Jesus that is our symbol of our church, right? Our the Christus, the open arms. He's not holding a clipboard. He's not saying, well, okay, there's you don't have to wait a year because this restriction. None of that. That's not the Christ. He wouldn't cast him out. And so that's when all of a sudden I changed. My heart was broken for him. And then I heard some other stories, and I started listening to some different podcasts. We hadn't met yet, about just some things that just didn't seem right to me. And then all of a sudden I realized, we've got to. The idea that we had a problem within the church became more prevalent. I know this is probably, a lot of people like yourself from where this longer. For whatever reason, I just wasn't tuned into it, but I became tuned into it. And so I thought, okay, Marcia, again, one of these things just kind of fell into her lap. The next indicated step, we want me to do, God. Well, I want you to have them come and speak to your leaders, Marcia and Aiden. So we met with Marcia on a Sunday, me and a few soft-hearted people in the stake, went through some things, and we agreed to take a risk. One of the challenges was they normally get paid for their time, and we don't pay for speakers. And I had to tell her that, and it was almost a point where I was hoping that would be a deal breaker because I was losing sleep over this. I invited bishops, elders quorum presidents, Relief Society presidents, a few other members that I thought would be supportive because I wanted it to be a good environment for them. And meanwhile, on their side of the desk, they're getting, their friends are saying, look, you're getting set up. You don't want to go there. These people can't be trusted. And so I finally said, look, I'll buy some books through my company. I'll buy you some books and, to cover your time from driving down to Pasadena, down to Orange County. And they said, fine, and so they showed up. They took a risk. I took a risk. And they shared their story, slides, the whole presentation they did at CCJ with, Aiden as a girl, Aiden now, her whole story. Our members, they were so loving and kind. There wasn't a dry eye in the room, really. And I had a number of long-term members come up to me saying, this is the most spiritual meeting I've ever been involved with in church in my life. And I gave him a little CTR band, kind of because he used to wear a What Would Jesus Do and got rid of it when he was going out of church. And at the end of that night, and you'll know what this means, as I was, thanking them and giving them hugs and thanking them for their time, Aiden says, I want you to know you're a member of my tribe. And
what a compliment.
Man, I just, I didn't know how significant that was at the time until some time had passed, but and he and I still stay in contact, as Marcia. In fact, she did a second version of her book, and she actually described this meeting that night in her book, which is kind of cool. So it's been memorialized, I guess you'd say. But that, so that gave me hope, and it's kind of like that parable of the kernel, the blade, and the corn, the one that Christ taught, which has a number of meanings. A lot of people just basically say, well, effectively the Lord takes care of everything. The farmer sleeps, and the miracle happens, and the seed grows into corn. But the thing of that is one thing I've learned is we still have a responsibility to till that soil, to do what we can to water that, make sure that the weeds aren't growing in there, so those seeds have a fighting chance. And I think that's the thing I learned from all this is you can't always get up in the same 3 days a week and till the same part of that garden. You got to do it differently. You have to be willing to try and do different things. And so that's kind of how all this evolved. I realized our stake wasn't a little seed, that our stake was ready to become a full-grown corn, at least in this respect. And then, of course, as the Lord works, I'm ready to go. And Don Cruz, my executive secretary, runs into Mike Seacrest at the Trader Joe's.
Now,
Haven't seen him in, I don't know. Go ahead.
Before we talk about Mike Seacrest, I just want our listeners, before we move on from Marcia and Aiden, they were on episode 166. So if you want to hear more of their story, you could refer to episode 166. So now let's go next.
Yeah, and again, spirit. guiding this whole thing. You can't make this stuff up. And also too, I want to just make sure because during this time, I was at a meeting with up in LA with Elder Ballard and Elder Razban, and they talked about reactivating Melchizedek priesthood holders. And that was the focus, that we needed to go back out and find these brothers and their families and bring them back to church. Well, the standard thinking, as I gathered from some of my peers, was, okay, you go through the list, who are your inactives, and pray, and so name, is more prominent, you go out and see them. But there was a bigger issue, and to me was everybody has a reason why they're not coming back to church, and as your brother's book pointed out, it's got nothing to do with being offended. That's not the reason why people don't come, is they're not connecting for one reason or another. There's no value there. They don't feel like they have a place. And so to me, the real issue was, and this was really, again, talking to my wife, and she kind of opening my mind to this, is, we got to create a place where people feel like they can belong here. And so that was kind of an underlying theme of all this was, what are people coming back to? This is, I'm digressing, but I think this is important. Once I was released, we'd already sold our house, and I was ready to, we moved here, and I was going through some old stuff I'd saved when I was a bishop back in 11th Ward. So this is 15 years ago. And I found these charts of, sacrament attendance and goal charts. I happened to save this. I have no idea why. Sacrament attendance meeting, perspective, all the usual stuff, right? And I started thinking, my gosh, 15 years later, we're still doing the same thing. It's changed names. It went from, whatever it was then to, ward goals, to key indicators, to real growth. We've got all these names, but it's the same thing over and over and over again. And everybody wonders why, things don't change. And again, maybe I'm not trying to be critical, because to me, Luke 1:37, for with God, nothing shall be impossible. We got to be willing to just listen, because I'm telling you, if there's one thing I learned from my calling in our state, is that the Lord works very fast if we listen.
Wow, what a statement. I
No,
agree.
he did. Like I said, so that kind of segues into Mike's secret. So we've got this Melchizedek priesthood thing rolling around in my head. What are we bringing these brothers to? Then I realized, we've got a lot of inactive gay brothers who serve honorable missions who aren't here. And then Mike falls into the lap. Don Cruz calls me up. You're never going to believe this. I ran into this guy I know. I haven't seen him for 30 years, whatever, 20 years. And, we went to the same stake together, same ward together when we were growing up in Palos Verdes. You got to talk to him. So I call him in, and I know you know Mike really well. That's how he introduced you and I that one time up in El Segundo when you came out. And we had an honest conversation. And I didn't try to change him. He didn't try to change me. And we just mutual trust and respect from the beginning. And I realized, gosh, he's a great emissary as a gay member of the church. He has honest experiences. He doesn't have an axe to grind. And his is a story. He's if you're looking for the perfect person to speak, he's a doctor. He's well spoken. I mean, Mike's great. And then he introduced me to you, and it just was clear. Mike, I asked him if he'd speak at state conference, and I know that was a huge ask. And of course, you were gracious enough to come out too to speak on Sunday, because I figured, as I told you before, maybe the millennial guy coming out over the pulpit's a big dose, but we'll bring in an older gentleman who's been a bishop from Utah to kind of tie it up, bookended on the other side, so people don't think I'm going nuts here. But it was a great weekend. It was beautiful.
I'd love to. I'd love to
Yeah,
read from my book. Just my words. This is on page 201 of Listen, Learn, and Love Embracing LGBTQ Latter-day Saints. So it's a couple paragraphs, listeners. Hang in with me. One of the best examples I've seen of following Sister McConkey's counsel, and her counsel was the gospel of Jesus Christ doesn't marginalize people. People marginalize people, and we need to fix that. Occurred at a stake conference in Long Beach East Stake in January of 2019. In the Saturday night adult session, stake president Emerson Fersch invited Michael Sechrist, an interventional radiologist and gay member of stake, to share his journey. He wanted Michael to speak because, in the President's word, he desired to create Zion where no one felt marginalized, but where all members felt valued and welcome. As I sat in the congregation, I watched Michael on the stand next to the stake president, President C. President Fersch, sensing Michael was nervous since he was about to come out as gay to the entire stake, traded seats with his counselors to sit by Michael. That simple act of kindness brought tears to my eyes. I thought, that is what the Savior would do. After Michael's powerful talk, when he came out gay, when he came out to the entire stake, he began walking back to his seat. President First got up to give his concluding remarks, and as these two men passed one another on the stand, President First stopped and gave Michael a big hug. Not a polite handshake, but a huge hug. I thought of the stake members witnessing that hug. If they needed to open up to a leader, they would know President Fersch is a loving and safe person to help them. If I were a local leader in that stake, I would see President Fersch's example as a way to better minister to my ward members. After the meeting, I was pleased to see a long line of stake members eager to speak to Michael for his remarks. I wish every LGBTQ Latter-day Saint could have that kind of experience in their stake. And Michael shared more of that on episode 168. That was kind of my window into that evening. We'll never forget that evening and what you did for Michael and his brave talk and the feeling of belonging that you're talking about that created for Michael. Not only belonging, but that his contributions would help your stake become a better stake. It's not just that he felt welcome, but he actually felt needed. Not as, and part of being needed was just his journey as a gay Latter-day Saint, that you actually needed that perspective in your stake. So I'll send it back to you to keep sharing. But I
Um,
remember the next day speaking your stake, and all the speakers were just, people. You were just, it wasn't just LGBTQ. It was, I can't remember all the speakers, but every speaker, and I think you may have had a person speak that wasn't even a member of the church at that meeting or a different one, maybe not. But I
no, you're
think you were
right.
just trying to create this feeling of Zion. And I think we recognize that you have priesthood keys, not just for the members, and at least, for everybody. Um, it's not just for those that are walking in the doors of the church. You have responsibility for thousands of people in that geographic area.
No, and that was, I asked a lot of people. I asked a lot of people in asking them to bare their soul, before everybody, particularly when so many have grown up thinking that this isn't what you do at church.
Yeah, and there was a
There's just
divorced woman that spoke that. I'm trying, my mind's going back to that meeting. There were a lot of people that spoke that weren't on the
well,
normal checklist path.
no, and that was intentional. I mean, I just, like I said, I knew what I was called to do, and I ran into opposition. I mean, I can tell you, I don't know, maybe I don't need to go into it, but I've had people I've served with intimately with me go over my head in complaints to the area president and questioning my testimony. I mean, you don't go through. It's like again, Robert Kennedy. He said, "Progress is a nice word, but change is its motivator, and change has its enemies." And there are people who just do not want to let go of whatever they're hanging on to. And
What would you say to local leaders that are worried that if they do what you do, that people are going to complain and may even go above their head to the area presidency? And that's another question. Did the area presidency ask you to quit doing what you're doing?
no, in fact, I'll tell you what, I had Elder Watkins out, and I just remember these names because this was all part of this thing. And I took him over to meet Pastor Russell as part of our, a lot of times the visiting authority wants to go out and do visits. And you're going to get the Long Beach East Steak, you know, tour. And we sat down and met with Pastor Russell. He loved it. In fact, I had told him I was bringing out Marcia Navy. He didn't say a word about it. Elder Clayton, Weatherford Clayton came out. That was the night Scott spoke, and he went up to Midnight Soldiers with us. So these brothers, it wasn't like some secret. We never operated in a vacuum. Elder Gent was the Area 70 that I most connected with during my service, and he was really kind of there as all these, all this was going on, and he never, he was always very supportive. He had to reach out to Elder Pearson on something once, or President Pearson, the area president, and he was supportive. So, Elder Holland made a comment. I'm not trying to sound like a name drop, and it's just things pop into my head. He was out early when I got called, and we had like an area training, and he made a comment. We got to have lunch with him, the state presidents and their wives, and he said that it takes, on average, 2 years for the membership to implement whatever changes they advocated, or requested or whatever. And I remember my jaw dropped. I thought, 2 years, who has time for that? It just shocked me. But then I realized a lot of it is, it's not, the resistance doesn't come from above. These brothers, like you said, you get keys. And I started to bring this up earlier. You're set apart with keys of authority. You can't get ahead of the brethren, because the brethren are the ones giving you the keys. Ultimately, all comes from God. And if you're following inspiration, you're the right one to be called, then you're doing what you're supposed to do with that delegated authority. At least that's the way I saw it. So I never really felt that, because I knew I was following the Spirit. I didn't worry about what anybody thought, And I think the thing any leader learns, I'm sure, as a bishop, you can get inspiration, but if you start thinking about it too much, we can talk ourselves out of anything. You can talk yourself out about calling somebody. Well, they're too busy, their lives. Once that you allow yourself to go down that path, you're done, and you're going to find yourself, at least for me, in this stupor of thought where you never really get out of it, and oftentimes you end up back where you started, which was the right decision. You could have saved yourself a lot of heartache. Um,
I love the way
but
you involved your wife too. I remember when I was called as bishop, that whoever called me said your real first counselor is your wife. And I love the way, this is you and Darcy. And obviously, you have counselors that you're involved with, and they're part of your stick
um,
presidency. But I just love the way you reference your wife, and I think that's helpful for all of us to involve our spouses in our decisions. That's what part of counseling together and getting better. So back to you,
well,
Emerson. I'd love you to
um,
get to, and I know you'll get to Scotty Osmond.
yeah, I know I can go on. You bring up the point about wives, though, and the one thing I always thought, 'cause I had a brother ask me, how much do you share with your wife? And look, like, you don't need to get into names and places, but we're gone. At least we used to be. I don't know. I'm hoping the schedule shifts with leadership now with the COVID, because there's some value at doing these kind of meetings from home, whatever. But you can't be gone all day and come home and see your wife and not give her some idea what you're dealing with. That's just wrong. You're gone all day. She's taking care of the house, taking care of the kids, whatever it might be. And then you go home and you keep your mouth shut like you've got some secret. That just doesn't make any sense to me. And so Darcy, because of her life experiences, she worked, she just has some very unique experiences from a lot of women. She was very helpful for me, and helped me see things. So anyway, yeah. So that's an important point that any leader needs to take away from this. I ran into no opposition, and maybe it's because we were in Southern California. I don't know, but they were very supportive with all this, And then so Mike came out. You remember that night? He had people lined up for an hour and a half. I got emails from people, and this is to your other point, that weren't gay, that didn't have gay family members, that just because he got up and spoke, they felt with their own personal. One gal I know suffered from a lot of depression. She felt like she had a place. It opened the doors for. I mean, sadly, but I think you may even said this to me. If a gay man is saved in your church, then everybody's got a place. I mean, sadly, but that's it. That's kind of where we are, and that's how it went. And so, Mike, he's just so brave, and he took a risk, and nothing gets done without somebody taking a risk. That's what I learned, and I will share this. I don't know, maybe it's not appropriate, but because you hear these stories from members and you start believing them that, oh, you're going to get thrown out of the church for doing this. I had somebody tell me when I got released, I was on some kind of watch list. I'm like, what is this, the CIA? I mean, it's church, dude, and, but, he, what was my point of all this? Oh, I had to get to a place where I was willing to accept whatever the consequences were, even if it was that extreme, because I knew what the Lord was inspiring me to do. That was not an agenda, like I said from the beginning. Nothing that came to my mind that was there in front of me, I was supposed to do. And so I had to get to a place where I was willing to, sacrifice everything, lay it all on the altar. And as I said, the leaders came through 100%. always supportive. And of course they would, because that's, you're following the spirit. Where's the problem, right? So anyway, then, Scott came along, and I know
Just a comment
that's
about that stake conference. I remember sitting there on the stand speaking Sunday, and after listening to Saturday night, the overriding impression to me was the number of lives that were changing, the pebble in the pond metaphor. And I looked at all those missionaries. It was just full of missionaries. And I thought that's the time when the Lord talks pretty closely as they're consecrating everything. And I just thought of their future ministry. Some of them are going to have LGBTQ kids. Some could be LGBTQ. Some of them would be priesthood leaders. And that stake conference experience, um, and the spirit, most importantly, perhaps the spirit that they felt there, teaching them about the doctrine of Christ. To me, that was the long-term impact of that will be for generations what happened that weekend.
yeah.
And I don't think you or I will ever understand how many conversations resulted from that meeting and how many lives were changed and that pebble, those ripples continue to grow and grow.
I
So
I
anyway,
had I had a brother come up to me actually that had been out there, who was out there for work, who was basically steak shopping, and came up to me, because all the confusion at the end of conference, people come up and you feel that spirit and want to just hug anybody you can get your hands on. And this brother came up to me and said, I'm moving to this state. I love this state. I love this spirit inclusion. This is where I want to raise my kids. And he moved
exactly.
in. He brought his wife from Iowa, and they came back. She spoke at a conference once, not too long ago. In fact, it may have been the last one we had before COVID. Um, but I realized that the job was, once we got Mike, and then it was clear to me, I'm not going to worry about the gay community out here. I need to worry about the gay community in here, in our state, in our wards. And so there was that one Sunday where Jeff Perry and I, my old bishop, he was on the High Council, decided, he knew Scott way back when he was a member, and said, let's just go visit him. And I've said this story so many times, I'm sure people are sick of hearing it, but there was a parking place right in front of his condo on a Sunday morning in downtown Long Beach. And that doesn't happen. I mean, it was like literally there for us. And we went, and I never met him before, and he was there. He was, I think, kind of on his way out, and I wanted to invite him actually to. I think the reason why we went was to invite him to Mike's School, is what it was, and because it was kind of an easy, you know, reason to go see him. And we talked, and Scott is just the kindest, softest heart you'll ever meet, and we just connected, and I listened to him talk a little bit and apologized to him. I just felt compelled to apologize to him for how he made me feel in church. And that went a long way. And then he and I met. He said, maybe we can meet and talk sometime. And I don't think, if he expected me to follow up with him or not. But I did. And he came in, and we spoke for, we had like a 3-hour meeting. And he had a whole, very organized. He had everything. He just talked. I learned so much listening to him, a lot. And it hurt. It's probably the one thing that's never been reconciled for me in the position of authority in churches, how it is that good people can get hurt by other people, whether intentionally or not, and how you reconcile that, because oftentimes it has this, as you, I'm sure, heard from people, long-term impacts, the pain of a leader rejecting somebody like Aiden, it's the same thing. That those wounds go real deep. And when people are talking about having trauma going into a church building, they're not making it up. It's real. And so to be able to create a place where there was safety in that, to have, like I said, my friend Dan Cash teach a lesson today in 10th Ward, who came back during all this because he's a friend of Scott's. Scott spoke, I asked Elder Clayton, and he said, sure. He knew it wasn't some secret, and so he was up there on the stand. In fact, I had Scott sit next to him because of the way it worked out. And he shook his hand. He sent him a beautiful letter of thank you, when a week or two later, and Scott gave a beautiful talk, and he ran it by me. And that's the kind of relationship that needs to be a part of these, when you're doing this kind of work with people, is Scott trusted me. We went through his talk. I gleaned some things out that I just didn't think would hit the mark, with the members, and he was open to it. And but yet he would still be able to tell his authentic story. And that was the thing. And so it just that sort of hammered home. That brought everybody to where, um, I think that was the final step in getting people to really open their hearts. It wasn't like a hit and run. This isn't something we're just doing because it's a cause celeb or it's the thing to do. I'm not here to entertain people. We're really trying to change hearts and unite people, because all these resentments, all these judgments, that's all the stuff that keeps us from being united and being brothers and sisters, in the gospel, and being true disciples with Christ. And I can tell you that I was not a guy who cared about a lot of this stuff, honestly, when I got called. I wasn't. I didn't, it wasn't like something in my head, okay, we got to bond bridges with the gay community and we got to connect, do some interfaith. I mean, it just, the Lord laid it out. We just had to follow it. And it was hard. It was hard. And so, kind of to the end of all this, I was done, honestly, emotionally from my assignment. I probably shared that with you about a year ago, right before the COVID.
And that way
Uh,
you'd been at about 6 or 7 years,
no, it was actually 5 at the
5
time,
years.
believe it or not. And yet you get
That's
in that
honest.
emotionally. Yeah, you get it, and the inspiration wasn't coming. It was like the Lord almost was kind of just reining the thing in. I told Elder Cornish that when I got released. I knew I was done. There were some things, administrative stuff that we were able to get done. We got our temple district changed from Los Angeles to Newport because it really makes more sense, and little things like that at the end. But I was emotionally spent, because when you and then we also had a group for divorced women that came up. That was another thing. I learned a lot about how this is the silent group with no voice a lot of times when there's these breakups in church. And it's hard. There's a lot of pain. And when you talk about bearing burdens, which is what we're commanded to do, the covenant we make as members, if you're really, and I'm not trying to sound like I'm some great guy, it's just when you actually go in and do it, whoever you are, it's emotionally draining. And I honestly I was spent. And so, being released last month, 2 months ago, 3 months ago, it was absolutely the right time. In fact, truthfully, it could have happened a year before. But anyway, but the work was done.
I
I,
appreciate you being honest. I think a lot of leaders are emotionally spent, and I got therapy as a YSA bishop the last year. It was only a 3-year assignment, Emerson, and the last year I finally started to meet with a therapist because I was just so emotionally, my gas tank was so low because of the complicated situations and just the toll. And I think that's a real thing that happens. And so it was just a 3-year window, and but as stake president for a 9-year window, with the kind of things you're doing. And I'm sure there's other leaders that probably feel the same way you do. And so I appreciate just being vulnerable and honest. And that's just who you are. And that makes it all safe for us to be vulnerable and honest to you because you are. Um, Talk about Scotty. What is Scotty's assignment in your stake?
Oh, so Scott was called, to be the stake young men's secretary. This was probably last summer, I think. And he accepted, and the young men's president at the time, which I think he's been changed now, although he's still in leadership on the High Council. But he was actually the guy who came up to me and said, "I'm moving my family into the state." He called him.
Wow.
He called him to be the secretary, and he saw the value, kind of as you mentioned, with Scott, with Mike. There's value in having that voice, because whether anybody wants to admit it or not, there are members who are gay, there are youth who are gay, and it can be, as I've learned, a very difficult place for youth to be, and feel like they can be their genuine self. And
So,
so having
Scotty,
a leadership like that can help.
listeners, there's so much of this story, and that's why you've got to listen to Scotty Osmond's podcast 162, Michael Sechrist 168. But you went on a Sunday morning to Scotty's home. The administrative load for a stake president, from what I would know, is that you're just all day in your building, or if you're in a geographic tight area, going between buildings. And the fact that you and Jeff Perry, I think, said, we're just we have this list of members and we're just going to leave the building right now and go to Scotty's door. And then Scotty, as he shares in the podcast, was guarded,
Yeah.
but has a great heart. And he just sensed pretty quickly you were a safe person to hear his story. And you just heard his story and you just loved him. And I think he prayed at the stake conference when you were released. If I've got my facts right, I think he mentioned that. But one day, when he was called in the stake young men's presidency, it was just during COVID. And so each member of the stake young men's presidency in your stake did a YouTube and they all spoke, as you know. And I listened to all of those and I listened to Scotty and and he talked about being gay. And I just thought of that 15-year-old kid in your stake who's gay or 13 or 17 and wondering if there's a place for them. And there's no LGBTQ people and senior leadership of the church that I'm aware of. There probably are, but they're not talking about it. And so it's hard to know where your belong is. But to see that video of Scotty and, that 15 or 17-year-old kid could be suicidal just thinking, I just don't feel like I belong. There's not people like me at church. And I just thought, you know, it's just a miracle. It's a miracle what happened on that Sunday morning to what
Yeah.
to where Scotty is in a stake young men's presidency. And sometimes we'll put gay Latter-day Saints, in my experience, we want to keep them away from the youth because some way that could influence them to be gay. But I think as I share in the book and you understand, I think a lot of our listeners, being around gay people doesn't make you gay. um, and it isn't contagious. So I think we're mature enough to realize that having Scotty in that presidency is just wonderful. And if you're a straight young man in your stake, the preparation of having Scotty in your stake helps you when you've got a gay companion, when you've got a gay kid down the road, when you're teaching an LGBTQ investigator, you have just more tools because you're not in this bubble. And that's one of the blessings I think that's been created in your stake. And is everything listeners that President Fersch has done and the stake leadership team there is scalable. It's not like they have a magical secret handbook that, did this. They just acted on their impressions to create Zion and they had support of their leaders. And our leaders are talking. If there's any need to, we can go back to Elder Ballard's April 2021 talk, and he just talked about half the membership of the church is single, the adult membership. And he used the word belonging multiple times. But to me, it's sort of taking President Ballard's talk, and this is how you do it. I mean, this is the application of creating a feeling of belonging. And that if you're a divorced woman or a gay Latter-day Saint or somebody who's battled addiction or somebody that doesn't have I know the church is true with every fiber of my being testimony, you belong and you're needed in the East Long Beach stake. And that to me, then that belonging isn't the final finish line. The belonging then creates the ability to connect with the gospel of Jesus Christ and the healing nature of the atonement. As our hearts change and we feel that love. So I got off a little tangent there, Emerson, but I'll send it back to you
Well,
for more
I,
thoughts.
well, we've kind of covered. I want to share an email with you. I think we talked about that.
Good.
It really kind of encompasses really what got accomplished. And then maybe I'll just say a last thing, unless you have any other questions.
No, that's good.
Um, and I just don't want to forget. Thank you, Richard. I know you and I have had some calls here and there. I've interrupted you in some Dodger games just to connect because anybody that's blazing a trail, the road less traveled, so to speak, it can be lonely at times. You
True.
feel like you're on an island, and it's good to connect and just get that support because as much as you can feel that confirmation in that truth, the spirit of truth pushing you and guiding you in a direction, we're human and often it's easy to feel like maybe you know insecure at times. So,
That's honest.
um,
I feel
but
the
I want
same
to,
way.
yeah. So I've appreciated that immensely from you. And so I got permission from this sister in our stake to share this. I'll leave her name out. She wrote a letter to Darcy, and I think I'll just read the whole thing, at least most of it here, because I don't think I could summarize any better. And this is, I should also say, isn't the only email that's like this that I got in cards from people. Um, it was a very transformative period of time in our stake. And again, I'm just grateful I was able to be there and listen and have people around me, like my wife and the guys I served with for the most part that supported me. Um, so she starts off, beautiful Darcy. I was thinking about you and remembering how many times your husband said that you were the inspiration to him during his service as stake president and reaching out to the LGBTQ members. I can't begin to express my gratitude to you for doing that. It was life changing for me. Now, this is really an important part of the transition here, or the transformation. I had absolutely no love in my heart for the LGBTQ community. Everything I had read and learned in the church helped me to believe that their lives were sinful, repulsive, and completely their choice. You and your husband's invitation, and in parentheses, along with Richard Osler, who I'm so grateful you invited to speak to us in that state conference, in parentheses, your and your husband's invitation to listen to our LGBTQ members took me on a soul-searching journey that broke my heart. I had prayed for the pure love of Christ like Moroni had instructed, but didn't begin to understand what that meant. The Savior's love is so pure and boundless that there was no way that prayer could be realized. My heart was just too small. I went through emotional and mental anguish trying to understand what the Spirit wanted to teach me. What I learned was that I could hardly begin to comprehend the Savior's love for each person. I was shocked and ashamed at how judgmental I really was, but hopeful that with God's help, my eyes would be able to see Him loving, blessing, guiding, healing all of His children. This came at such a critical time in my life. I was also struggling with loving some of my own children who were taking different faith paths. But with a broken heart and a contrite spirit, I was now able to see and love them. And then she goes on to add some compliments about my wife and her talks and other lessons she taught from time to time. And that's it. You know, that's the change that Paul talks about and tries to teach us, that transformation. And I'm, like I said, we in the beginning, we bring, we get blessed in these callings. We bring something to the table. I guess for me, I thankfully with a strong wife and good friends like you and others, and people who are willing to take risks, we're able to have that moral courage it takes to change things. And I'm grateful for my assignment because, Richard, I've really, like this woman shared, I've really learned I've learned the character of Christ. And I really enjoyed studying his words in particular. I dug into the parables probably for 2-3 years straight to really find the deeper meanings that are there, which are many. Christ is he's just so brilliant. Aside from being our Savior, he's just a brilliant teacher. There's layers, and he's consistent. You can't take his words and twist them around. The way he teaches, they are what they are. And he loves us, and it gets back to that symbol that President Nelson felt inspired to put on as a representative of the church, those open arms. That's it. What else is there? It's the parable of the prodigal son. He goes out, it's like me in a lot of ways. He goes out, lives this riotous life, he comes back. He doesn't even get a chance to open his mouth and repent before the father's got his arms around him. He's putting a ring on his finger, a robe around him, and shoes on his feet. He hasn't even repented yet, and he's already been welcomed back because the Father knows the heart. The Savior knows our heart. And that's the beauty of all this. And what I learned is people respond to that. They respond to that truth because it testifies to them here deep inside. And of course, it's on us to all be open-minded to it. But I'm grateful for leaders, like I said, Albert Gent in particular was very supportive. And I'm grateful that people just were willing to take risks. I've said that a few times, but none of this would have happened. And I'm thankful for things I've learned. I'm grateful that I've had a chance to serve. And anyway, I don't want to say I love the Savior. I love Jesus Christ. I love the feeling I have when I really feel like I've been able to get a little glimpse of that lonely path that he had to walk. You know, we get a little glimpse of that in a lot of different ways in our lives as parents, um, and oftentimes in these type of callings. But to be able to have the honor of being entrusted with this kind of a mission, and then of course the blessings that come from it, as hard as it was. I've made some lifelong friends. You know, Scott and I, and Mike, and you, and others. You know, you guys are lifelong friends to me now. And anyway, I'm just grateful for it. I've been known to ramble, so I'm going to clip it and leave it at that.
Well, that's great, Emerson Fersch. And on behalf of all the Long Beach East Stake listeners that would want to put their arms around you and thank you again for what you've done, and all the people beyond the borders of your stake, thank you for um, living and teaching the gospel of Jesus Christ, bringing hope and healing. And I'm your dear friend, and we're so grateful you were on the podcast. And I think our joint invitation for all of you is to just act on. You don't have to be me. You don't have to be President Fersch. Um, just do what you can do to apply the principles that you heard in this podcast and act on the impressions that you've heard. It's just one heart at a time. If you would like to reach Emerson Fersch, his email is in the podcast description, and I'll give it to you now. emerson.fersch@outlook.com. Listeners, before we sign off, we wanted to add 4 tributes to President Fersch. President Fersch is not aware this is going to be part of his podcast, but I felt impressed to reach out to members of his stake and have them add short tributes. And so these 4 tributes will be as follows, and they will conclude the podcast. The first 3 are from gay Latter-day Saints that are members of President Fersch's stake, who have been influenced for good in significant ways. We've talked about 2 of them in the podcast. The first one will be Scott Osmond, episode 162, if you want to hear Scott's full story. The next one will be from Mike Seacrest, and he was on episode 168. And the third one will be Brother Dan Cash, who has a wonderful tribute also. And our fourth and final tribute will be from a current bishop in the Long Beach East Stake, Brother Don Caruth from the Los Alamitos ward.
Richard, thank you for letting me say a few words in tribute to Emerson's amazing former leadership as stake president of the Long Beach East Stake. And I'm so grateful and excited to hear this podcast. I try to explain how special Emerson is to people who haven't met him or who haven't had the opportunity to be part of his mission of inclusion. And it's darn near impossible to explain or comprehend. But I challenge anyone to do any one of the 4 things that I found to be groundbreaking in his leadership. And the 4 are: 1, breaking cultural norms; 2, acceptance of self and others; 3, finding beauty in diversity; and 4, spiritual guidance and following the Spirit. So first is breaking cultural norms. Because Emerson wasn't confined to the way we always used to do things in the church, it allowed him the freedom to think outside of those boundaries and to question every single thing we do as members within our church culture. And saying this is the way we have always done it was a chance for Emerson to immediately dismiss that practice as status quo and question how it could be done more effectively or differently in leading us all back to Christ. And you can only imagine how that went over sometimes. If we continue to repeat everything we do in the past, we actively continue to dismiss people on the fringe, and we complicitly, if not actively, send messages of exclusion. Second is acceptance of self and others. Recognizing and being honest with current limitations is important, but it doesn't mean we need to feel threatened by those with different life paths. And Emerson never saw my own life path as a challenge to his own. He never saw it as a challenge to those within his stake. He saw it as a chance to learn and grow. Personal growth. He recognized Christ's example in me and gave me the benefit of all doubt that I was capable of receiving guidance from my own path in life. He allowed the Spirit to confirm these truths and to respect and support my own journey. He also never muted me. He encouraged me to have a voice and to use it whenever possible. He placed me in a stake young men's position to allow me to teach others who have an open mind, to be supportive to LGBTQ people and break free from the cultural norms of the past within our church. The third is finding the beauty in diversity, and diversity allows everyone to have a hero or a heroine. It allows us all to feel seen and heard, and it gives us a frame of reference to use when helping other people understand ourselves. And Emerson understood that, and he did his best to show us that what that diversity looked like and what it felt like. He pushed us to reach out to the homeless and ask them their name. He pushed us to identify better with members who were considered different: singles, divorced members, mental health issues, gay, transgender. All LGBTQ members were invited to share and become a part of the stake and to share their own spiritual journeys. When members were critical of the differences they saw, Emerson unwaveringly defended all of us as part of the world we live in and the right to fair representation and support. He protected vulnerable members by not allowing the majority to force their past norms as the only standards or topics of discussion in meetings. He took hits for pushing limits as long as those new limits allowed others to get closer to Christ. He organized holiday concerts with interfaith churches that allowed us all to sit in one space and to imagine just for a brief time what heaven, love, diversity, and acceptance really look and feel like. Fourth is spiritual guidance and following the Spirit. Emerson was a leader who chose the difficult paths. He placed openly gay men in stake callings. He created outreach groups for historically dismissed and discounted members. His norms were based on the need for Christ-like love and understanding, not based strictly on doctrine or culture. He was an example to me of when we allow the Spirit to guide us to truth and doctrine rather than allowing doctrine to dictate how or when we should be allowed to feel the Spirit. Emerson understood that normalization of sexual orientations in our church can't happen unless we have frequent discussions about them. We need to daily challenge how we view and exclude people in our everyday. For example, when we report on gender in the church, do we still report male and female only? What's the harm in putting down non-binary, transgender male, transgender female as options? It tells our youth that we have a place for them. We are ready to counsel them and help them come closer to Christ, and we want every one of God's children to feel welcome. There are so many ways in which we as church leaders and members can break these norms down and show the youth we're willing to be as open-minded as they are. I could go on for days about things we could do that would be simple but effective and would fit perfectly within church doctrine. As mentioned by Paul when he spoke to the Corinthians about putting away childish things, our membership's views on homophobia and transphobia are currently childish things. This church can't grow unless we are willing to put away childish things and become more childlike in our faith and humanity. And Emerson gave me a glimpse of what this church could really look like with true love and respect for everyone. I will forever be grateful for that. But more than anything, I'll be grateful for a friendship that will last more than just this lifetime, and for a person who helped me believe even more strongly in our Savior's mission and his atonement and what it means for me personally. Emerson, your wavering support made me feel welcome at the table of Christ. Before I met you, leaders in this church were verbally speaking from pulpits, saying that there's a place for me at the table, but offered no action of inclusion to speak of. You were the person who actually found a chair for me to sit in and food for me to eat at the table. You asked me to share my journey at your leadership meetings, state conferences, and ward meetings. Thank you for helping me feel heard. I miss and love you, Emerson, and your beautiful wife, Darcy, and incredible son, Ethan, more than you know. And I'm forever grateful for your examples of Christ's love.
This is Mike Seacrest in Long Beach, California. It was almost 3 years ago that I was asking God in prayer whether or not I should go to church in my new stake. The Spirit told me that someone there needed me. I figured at the time that it would be a young person struggling with their sexuality or gender identity, or maybe the parent of an LGBTQ child. But I did what the Spirit told me to do, and never in a million years did I imagine the person I was supposed to meet was my stake president, Emerson Fersch. I'll never forget the power of the Spirit I felt during our first meeting. I don't frequently cry, but I was in tears within the first few minutes of our discussion. I'd never felt so seen and understood and loved by a priesthood leader before. You probably can't understand how that feels unless you've spent a lifetime being misunderstood and made to feel broken and second class by well-intentioned priesthood leaders and other members of the church. The Spirit let me know that I could trust him. So I went way out of my comfort zone when he asked me to speak at stake conference and let everyone know what it was like to grow up as a gay boy in the church. That experience changed my life forever. Then I accepted a calling on the Stake Communications Committee and began running LGBTQ Family Home Evening and later Ally Nights. And suddenly, there was a place for people like me and a place for loving straight members of the church to come and ask questions and learn how to love and include people different from them. All of us together learned how to be better disciples of Christ. I remember telling President Fersch during our interview for my stake calling, "You know I plan on marrying a man someday, right?" I wanted to be completely honest with him always. And he responded, "We can figure that out when the time comes." He never said it in so many words, but the greatest lesson I learned from President Fersch was his example, and not to let differences in philosophy, policy, or belief get in the way of loving someone right now, because that's what the Savior would do.
Hello, my name is Dan Cash, and I'm a member of the Long Beach 10th Ward in the Long Beach, California East Stake. Emerson Fersch was my bishop, although I was not active during that time. He was also my stake president. In early 2019, he sent me a very thoughtful letter letting me know that he was thinking about me. Later that year, he asked me, an inactive gay Latter-day Saint, to say the closing prayer at the stake's Christmas concert. After some back and forth, I agreed to do so. Later, in early 2020, pre-COVID, Emerson encouraged me to deal with a membership issue that had been hanging over my head for decades. With his help, I did. He showed me kindness and friendship when I never thought I'd get that again from any LDS leader. I am now serving as an Elders Quorum instructor in my ward. Never did I ever think that I'd have a calling in the LDS Church again. One of the greatest joys of the past COVID-filled year is a group text that we have going with Scott Osmond, Mike Seacrest, and Emerson. Scott has dubbed us the Homo Council. Emerson's willingness to learn from 3 gay LDS men is astounding. Scott, Mike, and Emerson are 3 of the greatest men I know, and they are all heroes to me. I can say without hesitation that Emerson Fersch is a man of God. He lives his life based on Christ's teachings. I have become a better man because of Emerson's leadership, but even more importantly, because of his friendship. God bless Emerson and all the men and women in the church who are trying to understand what it means to be LGBTQ+ and LDS, and who are trying to make sure the church has a place for us to be.
Hey, Emerson, this is Don. At first, when Scotty reached out to me and said, "Hey, do you want to record one of these memos for the podcast?" I was thrilled. I'm like, "Yeah, I'm all in." But kind of when it got down to recording it, and you think, "Hey, how am I going to sum up the faith journey I've been on the last 7 or 8 years with you?" It's really kind of tricky if you're going to do it in just a minute or two, and I'm going to fumble through this as best as I can. I don't know if you remember this, but about 8 years ago or 7 years ago, when you first got made stake president, he came over to our house with Darcy, and we had dinner together. And I remember you're sitting in the living room couch, and I asked you, I said, "Hey, now that you're stake president, what do you think's different? What's changed in this stake?" And in true Emerson fashion, you weren't about to answer the question. You kind of hopped up and stared right at me and said, "Hey, what do you think's changed?" It caught me off guard, and I think my answer was pretty weak. And so let me answer that for you, 7 or 8 years later. If you had asked me back, when we're sitting on that couch, if I loved my neighbor, I would have said, "Yeah, of course." The second commandment, that's an easy one to keep. I don't have any animosity towards anyone. And I would have been genuine in that answer. And, from that time, you started putting me in front of some of these wonderful and dear and just kind gay members of our church and not of our church, and then on to some wonderful transgender people with these beautiful souls. And some of the walls that were in my heart started cracking, and I didn't know that they were there. And as I kind of look back on where I'm at, 7 or 8 years later, my answer to that question is so much different. I know with that second commandment, there's so much more about loving your neighbor. It has nothing to do with the lack of lack of animosity, but so much more of a genuine Christ-like love. And I felt Christ in that journey. I felt his love in my own hard-heartedness cracking. And again, a repentant process that I didn't even know I needed to go through. So anyways, my friend, I'm sure you're going to go and change and mix up a bunch of things up there in Utah too, but please know that I'm grateful for all those experiences I've been through, and I'm grateful for this wonderful community that I hold dear to my heart now. Thank you for that, and God bless, my friend.